For this next look at layout, we're going to dig deeper into the animation side of layout's capabilities. We're going to look at some of the key ingredients that make animation possible in Lightwave on an advanced level. So tools like the graph editor and the scene editor will help us explore keyframes on a more in-depth level and allow you a lot more freedom when it comes to editing keyframes. So we're going to build up a little space scene, and to do that I'm going to come in and I'm going to load up a few simple objects, but this will give us a chance to do a little review on the whole issue of scale. So let me jump over to Modeler before we go back to the layout. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out, close all objects, and get rid of all my previous objects that I've been using for these lessons. Alright, so from my library, I'm going to load up some elements from the space scene, space folder. So if you do not have access to this content, then again, you can just utilize simple shapes, cubes, spheres, what have you, to replicate what I'm doing with the keyframes. It's really not critical, but if you want to follow along, you're welcome to. So inside my classic content, I have a space folder. I'm going to import something called twinkling stars. Now, twinkling stars, if I hit A to autofit, you can see here they are, just kind of sporadic points in space that would represent stars when they're rendered out in layout. Now, if I hit A for autofit, then I zoom out automatically to fit the entire star field in view. You notice when that happens, my grid size goes way out to 20 kilometers, 20 km. So if you're at all familiar with the metric system, you know that kilometers are, on par with miles in the British system. So the scale that we're looking at is quite massive. So that means that if we were to compare this with a typical object in Lightwave, we would be completely out of sorts. So for example, let me load up another element. I'm going to load up another object from the same folder. This is called Little Spaceship, so obviously by its name it implies it's quite small. And you can see it's just a little dot when I'm at 20 kilometers on the grid, but if I hit A for autofit and zoom in, you can see that, well, I'm actually at 5 meters when I've got this in full view. So that's a big difference between 5 meters and 20 kilometers. So that means that these two elements are completely disproportionate in size, and that's intentional, because the stars are meant to represent an entire star field, whereas this is just supposed to be your main character, your main object that you're going to focus on. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up another spaceship of a different scale. Let's go to Load Object again, and I'm still in that same folder. And let's go with the Armed Cruiser. I'm just going to say no to all the textures. I don't need those. Hit A to autofit. And now I'm at 100 meters. So 3 very different scales. I've got the Armed Cruiser at 100 meters, a little spaceship, which you can see on a 100 meter grid size looks quite small. Again, A to autofit, now it's 5 meters. And then of course the twinkling stars, which brings us out to 20 kilometers. So 3 very different scaled elements. I'm going to send these over to layout, and then we'll get to work with those. So here is my star field. You notice as soon as I do that, the grid size jumps to 50 kilometers, which is what we saw back in Modeler at 20 kilometers, kind of on that same scale level. So it stands to reason that if we were to import the other elements, right now we just have the one, twinkling stars. I'm going to go back to Modeler and send over the others. So I'll jump to Little Spaceship and then send that over. And you'll notice that even though it's there, I can't see it. I can't see the little spaceship because I'm so far zoomed out. I'm still at 50 kilometers. So again, hopefully this will get you an understanding of why scale is very important. So I would have to manually come in here and say, well, let's go to like 5 meters because that's what I had with the little spaceship. And there it is. Now I can see it perfectly. And the stars are nothing but something way in the distance. So let's just do a quick test render to see what I'm talking about here. And, well, this is a happy little accident. Okay, I did not expect this, but here you go. I can see the entire star field. Why? Because I forgot to move my camera. My camera is still bounced out by that first import that I did with the little twinkling stars, or the big twinkling stars, and let's see where the camera is. I'm going to select my camera down here, and I have only one camera, and you can see on the z-axis it is sitting at negative 600 kilometers, so it's way out there in order to get a shot of the entire twinkling stars. Now I don't want that, so what do? If you saw the last lesson, you know what to do. Zero out all of my axis points, and there we go. I just did 0, 0, 0, and I put the camera right in the middle of my universe where it belongs, so I can set it up properly. So I'll just move the camera back a little bit, get it into position so that if I were setting it up, I can see now this would be a pretty good angle for my little spaceship. Right there in the middle. Alright. Well, I've got a little landing pad for my spacecraft, and I don't really need that. So if I go back to objects and look at my little spaceship, is 2 layers. There's the layer 1, which is the spacecraft, and then there's the layer 2 of the landing pad. To get rid of an object or a extra camera, you have to have at least one camera, but if you have multiple cameras or multiple lights, you can get rid of any element that's safe for removal. You can do that with the minus key. Now again, if you hadn't watched my other lessons, the minus key is a dangerous shortcut to remember, because when you utilize this in Modeler, it does something completely different. It does not delete polygons, does not delete objects in Modeler. It hides them. It hides them. So be very aware of that keyboard shortcut. It is something that messes people up quite regularly. So I'm going to say yes to this and get rid of that platform. So when you're in layout, minus removes objects. Okay. Let's just get the light out of the way. I'm just going to move it over. We'll have lessons on lighting, I promise, but not this one. All right, so let me go hit the D key to bring up my display preferences once again, and you will then be able to set a double vertical window, which I mentioned on the previous lesson that I like to use because it allows me to set up a camera view, so I'm always looking through my camera. I'm always got some sort of awareness, even if it's just a small window. You can make this as small as you want, but you always want to have at least a tiny little window reminding you of what your camera is looking at. Even if you have multiple cameras, you want to be able to switch this around. So, all right, so now we're getting set up. And let me go back and do another test render. Now that I've got my camera back, hit render frame, and there's what I'm talking about. So now I'm shooting my spaceship, but the stars are in the distance as they should be. So I'm in the middle of that star field. All right, and let's bring in over the armed cruiser while we're at it. So we've got all 3 models. Let's just bring over the armed cruiser, send it into layout as well. We don't need those texture maps, just let those go. And once again, I'm dealing with a new scale element, so if I zoom out on my magnifying glass, there it is. It's sitting, squashing actually my little spaceship, but I can see my little spaceship is actually contained in the middle of this object. I'm going to go ahead and move this object forward so it's not in the way. And, oops, didn't want to do that. Let me just keep moving forward. Get this so that my little spaceship is separate from it. So now I've got the spaceship tailing the armed cruiser, which is kind of this giant, I don't know, if you're a Star Wars fan, I guess this would be on par with one of those Star Destroyers. In terms of scale, anyway. And this would be like your little X-Wing fighter or something like that. Alright, so let me give a little tilt to this. I'm going to hit Y for rotate and just give it a little bit of an angle so we have some perspective and maybe a little bit of bank for visual interest. There we go. Okay, so it's flying through space. Do another test render, and this is what it looks like. And, okay, so not bad. Let's keep going now, and let's start by adding some animation. So the reason we're doing this is to really, like I said, to explore keyframing in Lightwave and how you can edit and adjust keyframes. So we learned previously that the slider down here, the timeline, allows you to set keyframes, points in time and space that create motion. So right now I've only got one keyframe. It's set at 0, and that is for my little spaceship. every object, every light, every camera has its own timeline full of its own unique keyframes and own unique motion paths. So we're going to start with the little spaceship. And what we're going to do is create a motion path for this spaceship that enables us to fly forward and around this larger ship. So let's hit the T key for move. And remember that every 30 frames equals 1 second of time. So I've got 4 seconds in my timeline. Let me go ahead and move this to the 30 marker for my first second. And I like to use increments of 1 second, even increments of 30, just to kind of keep things even when I first start my motions. And then I can always speed up or slow things down as I go deeper into the process. So I'm adding a new frame every 30 frames, a new keyframe every 30 frames. I'm just sort of roughly marking out a path. And I accidentally clicked on the armed cruiser, so I'm going to go back to the little spaceship. There we go. And it's hard, you know, to do this accurately in perspective view because perspective view does tend to lie to you. It's kind of hard to know exactly where your keyframes lie in space unless you maneuver around and just double check it. And you can see now from different perspectives kind of where my little spaceship's going. And for the last one, I'll move it further out. All right. Now, if I do a preview, I can see what that little spaceship's going to do in terms of speed. So that's the trajectory, that's the speed. You can notice it's fairly even in its trajectory and speed. It's fairly fluid, and I don't see a lot of starting and stopping or slowing down or hitting the brakes at all. It's kind of just, it's very even. So that means that I've spaced these out evenly here, but also fairly evenly in terms of the distance that it's traveling. So just keep in mind, the longer the distance it travels between the same amount of time interval, the faster it's going to need to travel. Because if you think about it, if there's more distance between these two points in space, it has to travel faster in order to accomplish that distance in the same amount of time. It would be like saying, well, I want you to go halfway down the city block in 1 minute versus now I want you to go 5 city blocks in the same 1 minute of time. Of course, if I'm asking you to do both things, one is going to be much faster than the other in terms of what you have to do to make it 5 city blocks in 1 minute. You're going to have to travel a lot faster. Well, let's think of the same thing with keyframes and motion paths. So now we've got a basic flight path laid out. We've previewed it. We get to have a good sense of the speed. How can we edit this further? Well, let's take a look at some of the tools designed just to do just that. So under the Modify tab, you've got something called the Path tool. And the Path tool allows you to just grab these existing keyframes and bend them and move them. It's really handy for fine-tuning a motion path like this where you're trying to sculpt out the trajectory in a more specific way. Maybe I want the little spaceship to kind of go underneath it first and then come out and over. And again, it takes a bit of doing because, again, the perspective view lies to you in many respects, and it doesn't always tell you exactly what you think it's telling you. So I kind of have to get a lot of different angles to get a sense of this. All right, that's a lot more zigzaggy, a little bit more ambitious than it was when I first created it. It's probably going to force a much faster trajectory as well. Having a hard time getting this underneath. I may need to use more orthographic views if I really want to get accurate with this, but I'm trying to just do this the fast way. Sometimes it actually takes longer doing things with perspective view because it lies so much that you end up wasting time that you could have saved by using orthographic views like top, bottom, side. But let's give this a try. I'll do another preview and see what my adjustments did to the speed of the craft. You can see now that middle section especially is a lot faster than it was. It's slow at first, and then it has a lot of distance to make up there, so it really kicks into high gear. Alright, that gives me a sense of things. Now, if we were to look at this through the camera view, let's do another preview, but this time I'm going to use, instead of perspective, I'm going to choose the camera view. Now, this is what the camera sees. So obviously, very different from what we saw just using the perspective view, because now we're seeing it through the lens of the camera. And you'll notice that there's a lot of flying going on, but as it gets further away from the camera, it becomes smaller and smaller and harder to follow. So there are certain things we can do to the camera to help the camera follow the action, and we'll get to that in a moment. But before we even do that, I want to give you a quick introduction to the graph editor so you have an understanding of what's happening. The graph editor looks very scary when you first open it. And because I had my little spaceship selected when I did open it, it automatically loads the little spaceship parameters into the graph editor so I can see what's going on. So let's take a look at how the graph editor works. First off, these are all the parameters of my object: rotation, position, and scale. Those are the three basic parameters that are associated with every object. Now, on the graph, you can see at the bottom, from left to right, these are my keyframes, or it's an exact duplication of what I have here on my timeline, going from 0 to 120. So here's 0, here's 120, and these little markers represent my keyframes. So 30, 60, and 90, and then 120. So I've got 4 of these, plus, of course, well, the one I had from 0. So altogether, we've got 5 keyframes. All right, let's take a look and break this down. So the first, let me just widen this so you can see this better. The first red is my X position. So when I click on this over here, I'm highlighting the position on the X-axis. So if you think about this, this is really your side-to-side lateral movement. So this represents kind of a dip to, let me just see if I can choose a view that would better represent that. Let me go to the front. Maybe the back is a better angle. There we go. Let's do the back. All right, so what I'm looking at in my graph editor with these values, here I've got a 35 meters, and then I'm on negative 272, etc. But you can see this kind of zigzagging up, down, up, down. That is my side to side. So that is, starts here at 0 on the right, and then it goes left, and then it goes right, and then it goes left. All right, so that's what you're seeing here on the X position. On the Y position, this is the up and down motion. So you can see this will coincide with where the spaceship goes up in height. And so it starts here, it goes up a little bit, and then it dips down, and then it goes up again. So this is the Y position represented by this path. So again, it goes up, and then down, and then up, and then down a little bit. The Z position represents the top view. So for example, let me switch this to top and zoom out. And you can see now basically what's happening is there's a zigzag, it's ascending, it's going backwards pretty evenly up until here, and then it dips. Instead of continuing to go away from the camera, it comes a little bit closer back to camera, and then it goes away again, represented by this angle of the motion path. So if you're having difficulty understanding what all this means, it basically is a visual representation of your keyframes as they go through space. So for example, if we wanted a more even trajectory so it doesn't speed up and slow down, we want this to be a more of a straight line and less squiggly. So right now, this between here and 30, we have a fairly soft start. It's not very fast. The steeper the incline, the faster the motion. So you can see the distance between 30 and 60 represents a pretty fast increase in speed. So if we were to come in and just start manipulating this to even it out, let's say, to kind of make the trajectory more even, now I've got kind of a straight line all the way through. And what that does is it keeps the speed more in check. So now if we do a preview, let me go back. We'll do a camera preview through the camera view. And you notice now the speed is more even-tempered. It's not as disconnected from between the keyframes as it was. It used to be faster in the middle, slower at the front and end. Now it's more consistent. And that is because of our adjustments in the graph editor. So we've got now a pretty straight trajectory. Now, if we were to exaggerate these values on the Y, you can see immediately the effect. What's happening is that we're getting, let me go to perspective view so I can zoom out quickly, but we're getting a stronger dip here, and if I can fit both of these on the screen at the same time, I'm going to shrink this down so I can try and do that for you. But watch this. As I take my dip at 60, you see how that moves? It's pretty obvious, but you can see if I want to go deeper, I can just move it on the graph editor and I can accomplish that. I can go up higher or lower. Again, I can just use the graph editor to help fine-tune the motion path in a lot of different ways. So that's the Y. The x-axis, as I mentioned, is side to side, so let me prove that. I'm going to come up, go a little higher. Now it goes more to the right. Down here, more to the left. More to the right. You get the idea. So these keyframes in the graph editor correlate directly to your motion path and give you a much better understanding of how it works. I didn't add any rotation or scale adjustments, so these will be flat. You can see these don't do anything. Completely flat. Flat means no change. Up and down, change. Flat, no change. So this is your first little introduction to the graph editor, but hopefully that helps explain a few things about it. How it correlates to your keyframes. Okay, so I mentioned that we could get the camera to follow the action a little bit better. Right now, if we go to camera view, this is what we see. And this is not a very accurate preview, but this, you can see the flight path is kind of all over the place. It's zooming around, and not much is really happening with our spaceship in terms of visibility. So let's see if we can get the camera to follow this better. Remember when we took a brief look at the different views available in layout? Top view, bottom view, back, front, right, left, perspective, light view, and camera view. We've used all of these, at least briefly. We didn't spend too much time in the light view, but we'll get there. But anyway, we've used these others quite extensively, including the camera view. Schematic is the one I told you we'd get back to later. So let's take advantage of it. All right, here we go. Here's my twinkling stars. This is an object, and that's black. Little spaceship, another object, black, and armed cruiser. 3 objects, orange light, white camera. All right, so these are my elements. What I want to do is I want to create a relationship with the camera and the little spaceship. So I'm going to move these rectangles next to each other just for simplicity. To create a relationship, we can create what's called a parent-child relationship. Parent-child relationship, you want to think of a parent holding the hand of a child. And so when the parent crosses the street holding the child's hand, the child will come with it. But the child is its own entity. So the child can still move on its own, even though it follows the general guidance of the parent. So the child can rotate, it can move away from the parent, but it still follows the parent. So if that's a little confusing to you, let's see it in action. I'm going to grab the child, which in this case will be the camera, and I'm going to control click with my keyboard, control click on the parent, which is the spaceship. Now you can see there's a white line connecting the two for the parent-child relationship. Let's leave the schematic view and go back to camera view. Now let's watch what happens when we hit play. You'll notice now my camera is locked on and coming with the parent, which is the little spaceship. So let's get another angle of this, see what's happening. I'm going to go to the perspective view, and you'll be able to see this better, I hope. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm also going to target the action with the target button. But let's get a little closer so we can see what's happening. There is the offset, and you can see the distance now between the spaceship and the camera. There it is. Let's hit play and see what happens. You can see now the camera is locked on to its parent. So the camera is the child, the parent is the spaceship. Now, as I mentioned, the camera, being the child, it can do its own thing to a degree. So I can pull it back, for example, to get a wider field of view. And I can also move it to the side to get a slight of an angle. I can rotate it so that it's following from an angle, from the side maybe. And I can keep moving and rotating until I get the camera angle and the perspective that I like in my shot. Let's see what that looks like. Now the spaceship is located in the lower third portion of the frame as it flies around the big spaceship. So that is a parent-child relationship. Now you notice another thing. When the spaceship flies, it looks very strange because it's levitating. It's going around the large spaceship, but it's not actually banking or turning or anything like it should if it were actually flying. So if you think of a roller coaster following the roller coaster track, this really isn't doing the job, is it? So there's a shortcut for that. We could keyframe it using rotation to mimic the banks and all of that in the turns. But there's a better way. Hit the M key on your keyboard. M is for motion options, the keyboard shortcut for motion options. Because I have my camera selected, it's giving me the motion options for the camera. Okay, so that's not what I want. I want the motion options for the spaceship. So I'm going to click on the spaceship now and click the M again. And now I'm looking at the motion options for the spaceship. Very important distinction, and I want you to be aware of that because it's an easy mistake to make. We do this all the time, clicking because we're going forward in the process, but we forget which object is currently selected, and therefore a mistake happens. So just be aware. Now, at the top of this, we can target, we can parent, we can pull items. So what I want to do is I want to go to Controllers and Limits. Controllers and Limits, this gives me the opportunity to automatically put in rotation. So for the heading of my object, which is the red wheel, remember the X or the heading, that is going to be aligned to path. And same for the pitch, which is the tilt, remember? That is the green wheel, aligned to path. Same for the bank, aligned to path. That is the blue wheel, side to side. Now let's watch as this kind of spaceship airplane gets back into action. Let's see what this looks like. Hit play. And notice now it's tilting, it's rotating, it's pivoting, it's banking according to the motion path. So it's kind of now like a roller coaster following its tracks, which gives us a much more interesting look and feel, and it just feels more natural. So that's M for motion options for aligned to path. And there, of course, the camera's still following, doing its thing. There it goes. It's also doing its job by tilting and rotating as it should. But we can also take the camera a bit further as well. Let's say, for example, we want the rotation of the camera to follow the action, not just the physical body. We can go to M for motion options now that the camera's selected and choose on the top, target item. Target item. And I'm going to choose the little spaceship. Notice now it's got the camera lens locked on to the rear of the spacecraft, and there's a orange dotted line connecting the two. So now when it goes, it follows that spaceship and puts it right in the middle. So I'm not really happy with that because it's kind of ruined the composition of my shot, because now it's forcing the spaceship to be in the middle of the frame, which I didn't want, but I just wanted to point that out to you. This is going to be great for lights, for spotlights, but targeting an item can definitely create a lot of, or solve a lot of problems and get you to where you may be looking to go faster. But in this case, I don't really need it. I'm following the craft the way I like, and I like the framing, so I'm just going to turn it off. Alright, so let's talk about now the keyframes once again. So we looked at the graph editor and we talked about how we can tweak the position of the motion path on the X, Y, and Z plane to get what we want. But there's another way you can tweak motion paths, and that is called the scene editor. There's 3 different scene editors in Lightwave. There's the scene editor dope editor, there's the new dope editor scene editor, and there's the classic scene editor. Now, these are all scene editors, but they all kind of have different features. So all you really need to use is the top one, the dope editor. The dope sheet refers to this column over here, these cells of keyframes. And I'm going to move this over so you can see it better. You notice that I've got the same timeline, 0 to 120. There's 120, but in order to see the others, I have to slide this over. That can get cumbersome. So here's a little trick. If you grab the edge of this, the handle here, this becomes blue, that corner, and just drag it all the way to the end, that scales or zooms out of the cells so that we can see everything all at once. So now I can see 0 to 120 all in one sitting. Now the cells are smaller, so it makes you squint a little more, but hopefully it's not too difficult on your screen to handle. Now here's one big thing in Lightwave that they need to correct, and hopefully in future versions they will. You notice the default setting for the camera, the color coding is a little strange. The color coding the keyframes for the light are orange to coincide with the orange light. The black elements, the cruiser, the objects, are all black and they're very visible. But they decided to make the camera gray, which does not show up real well when you have a gray background. So yes, there is a keyframe for the camera, it's right there, but you can't even see it because the color coding is terrible. So I recommend that you change the color coding on your camera. And you can do that by clicking on the little camera icon. Just click on it and you'll get this little pop-up. It's really easy to do, so change it to something more visible, okay? Something easy to see like, oh, I don't know, magenta. All right, now you can really see it stands out. You got orange, you got magenta, there's no denying your camera. And you can do this with any object. Just click on the little icon in front of the name and you can change the color or use a custom color if you run out of colors. But yeah, just a little friendly advice there. I would definitely change the color on your camera because it's really tricky when you get keyframes involved. Alright, so why are we looking at this? Well, these are my keyframes, obviously. You can see on my little spaceship I've got my keyframes set up. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as I mentioned. This is a place where you can edit these keyframes. So let's say, for example, you did want to speed up the spaceship's flight path between 60 and, 90. Well, remember, if we move 90 back, that is going to do just that because now it's got more ground to cover. It's got more ground to cover in less time between what is now, 103 and 120. And it's going to slow down this element because now it's got more time. Okay, so it's got, if we go this way, then it would speed up the distance between the 60 keyframe and the 90 keyframe. So this allows you to adjust speed. It allows you to adjust keyframes. Here's another thing you should be aware of. You can do groups of keyframes in here. I can click and drag to select the entire group. So if I want to create some space or a pause here at the beginning or to slow this down, I can stretch out this point in time by moving all these over to the right and then changing the ending of my movie so that it's longer. So I'm hoping this gives you some ideas as to how valuable this really can be. This is an incredibly valuable tool at your disposal, and this is the best way to edit timing or make timing shifts and major adjustments with the flight paths or the motion paths or in your animation in Lightwave. So this is something, of course, that exists in all animation software, but this is the Lightwave version of it. Alright, so let's give it a try. Let's go ahead and I'm going to close this out for a second. Let's give some motion to the large spaceship, the armed cruiser. And this thing is big and cumbersome and unwieldy, and it's, like I said, it's kind of like that Star Destroyer. So it's going to move very slow in proportion to the speedy little spaceship. So I'm going to just move it back a little bit at 0. And I'm just going to go right to 120. It doesn't need any additional keyframes. We're just going to keep it simple. It's going to move a little bit over here, and I'm going to give a little bit of rotation as well this time. So it's going to rotate from its first frame. So I'll start it here a little bit more straight, and then it's going to finish a little bit crooked, a little bit more tilted, and a little bit more banked. So let's just see how that looks now. Let's make a preview. It's always a good idea to make previews constantly to keep checking what you're doing. Alright, so through my camera, I have a great shot now of my little spaceship, but I can't really see anything going on with the armed cruiser. So let's try something. Let's maybe take the camera back a little bit. I'm going to go to perspective view for that, just to make my view of this easier. Let's switch over to camera. I'm going to pull back quite a bit. Let's get a wider shot. And on top of that, why don't we set up our camera settings, because the aspect ratio is not correct. You can notice it looks a little square. Let's go to camera properties, and you should already be familiar with this from the previous lesson, but we're going to change. We're going to keep using perspective camera, as I mentioned. This will be our go-to camera, but we're going to change our focal length. We're going to make it a little wider. It's going to go like a 20mm lens, and I'm going to switch resolution to 720. And you notice now it's more rectangular, the aspect ratio. So I have a wider field of view, more cinematic, with my 16:9 aspect ratio, which is HDTV 720. I'm going to go ahead and leave off the anti-aliasing for speed purposes and the motion blur. We're not going to activate those just so we can speed up our render times, but this will go ahead and at least get us ready for our output. But while I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and do that as well. So space, render 1, and it's going to go to my desktop, hit save. Of course, the type is QuickTime.move. That's all I need. All right. But let's go back and preview that so we have a sense of what it's going to look like. I'm going to go to preview, make preview, camera. All right. So I'm following the spaceship, but it's very rocky. There's a lot of movement going on, and it's a little hard to follow. So what can we do to clean that up a bit? Maybe let's make it so that the camera has got some keyframes of its own, so it's not so prone towards following every single bit of the little spaceship. What I can do is create a keyframe at 60, hit Y to rotate it, and I've got the camera selected. I'm going to create a new keyframe for the camera so it's actually focused a little bit more on this part of the action. So here now it's coming in, we can see a little bit more of how the spaceship reacts to the bigger spaceship. And at 120, I think I'll do the same thing. I'm going to have it kind of come down a little bit. Let me check the position on this as well. Go to perspective view. Here you can see the field of view of my camera as it flies around this big spaceship. And we can kind of check how this happens. There it goes. So this would be my dynamic camera. And here we can see this a little bit better through this camera view. This is great at sort of capturing the speed of the spaceship and what's going on with it, but it's a little bit maybe too chaotic to use by itself, so I may want to intercut this using a video editing program with a more stable shot. So let's make a new camera. I'm going to go to Items, and I'm going to go to Camera, and I'm going to call this Fixed Camera. This will be my second camera, and this camera is going to cover the action in a different way. So what it's going to do is it's going to just kind of stay back and watch the big spaceship interact with the little spaceship from a distance. So you can see the speed there. Now don't worry about the other camera, it's not going to render, but you can definitely see it's that little pink object flying behind the spaceship. That's the other camera. So how does that work? If I have more than one camera, I've got now my basic camera and my fixed camera. If I have two cameras, how does that work? Can I tell Lightwave to switch from one camera to the next? The answer is no, you cannot. But what you can do is you can render out both camera views and then edit those together in post-production using the video editing software. So some people are more exact in that they know for a fact they want to use the first camera for the first, let's say, 2 seconds, and so they'll only render from 0 to 60 with that camera, and then they'll switch to, let's say, the dynamic camera and render only from 60 to 120. And you can do that simply by just, typing in the number right there and do a render with a new beginning. That's perfectly fine. But that's just a way that you can start to micromanage your camera coverage for your action shots. Couple other things before we end this lesson, but I wanted to point out that yes, the scene editor is the best way to manipulate keyframes using the dope sheet and the dope editor. So if I do want to make things go faster or slower, say for example with the armed cruiser, I can speed this up or keep it where it is. But when it comes to minor adjustments, there is another way. You can click on the little drawer and you can access the keyframes. Whoops. Created an accidental keyframe here. Let me just delete that. Alright. You can select a keyframe like 60 and move it using this little drawer. Just select it and drag it over. So that's a quick and easy way to do things if you don't have time to open up the scene editor or if you don't have real estate for it. Just realize it's there. The problem with this method is that you can only edit what you see on screen from a very specific object, and it's not as comprehensive as the dope sheet. So I don't tend to use it very often. I just wanted to point it out to you. And if you're having difficulty with it and you're not able to get the results you want, then I can pretty much guarantee you that you need to go to your dope sheet and solve the problem there. Okay, because as we get deeper into Lightwave, you're going to understand that keyframes can be fairly complex. When we start getting into character animation, then you'll realize that there are things related to keyframe animation that are a little bit more tricky than just moving, left to right. So without getting into too much detail, I'll just say that yes, it's good for a quick fix. If you just have a quick adjustment, and let's say you put it on the wrong frame and it really was supposed to be at 70, you can move it over, but I wouldn't get too married to it, the process. So I think that about covers our first look at the scene editor, the graph editor. We'll be coming back to these elements as we go deeper into Lightwave, but for this point in time, I think it's good enough. If you have been following along and you'd like to render out the scene, you're more than welcome to. Whatever camera view you prefer. I'll try my fixed camera here and do a quick render under the Render tab. I already set up the output, so I'll just hit yes and let it render the scene. But you notice it's going pretty quick. I'm averaging, let's see, about a half-second render time per frame because I don't have any anti-aliasing, I don't have any motion blur. And this is exactly the kind of thing that you should do on your first render. You shouldn't be automatically turning those anti-alias features and motion blur features on because they will slow down the render time. And if it's your very first render, you really should just assume that there's going to be issues with it and that you may want to make those adjustments. I'm going to abort that because I just realized I never set up the properties for my fixed camera. I did it for the other camera, but every camera is unique, so I do need to change this for each and every. I'm not going to turn on motion blur, which I was just talking about, or the samples for that, but I do want to make sure that I get the resolution correct, so I just fixed that and I'll do another render now. But now they're about a little over 1 second, so it's slightly longer because I've added more resolution to it, but that should give you some sense of why we're doing what we're doing in terms of the settings. And if you ever forget what settings you picked, you can always refer to this chart up here. It tells me that my resolution, that's how I knew it was off. I was just looking at this and speaking to you and realizing, oh, my resolution is not what I thought it was. But yeah, it tells you the name of the camera, the type of camera, all of the settings that have been active. And you can see my anti-aliasing settings are 1 and 1, which is no anti-aliasing. And that essentially means that I'm going to get faster speeds but lesser quality, which is fine for your first render. Again, I always recommend people do a test render before they do their finalized render. If there's a scene that just takes too long and you can't afford to do a test render, then I would advise you to just, go with the added settings then and there. But for the most part, you should try and plan on 2 renders for at least minimum. But of course, as you become more advanced, as you become more comfortable making renders and doing animation, your workflow is going to speed up. It's inevitable. It's always going to be slower at first, like any software or any new thing that you're learning. You're not going to be at your optimal speed when you first begin. It's going to get better. It's going to get, you're going to get more smooth. But don't get sloppy. Don't get lazy. You want to always discipline yourself enough that you remind yourself to go back to the basics and make adjustments. Do test renders, because when you start accepting the first render every single time, that either means you're really in a hurry or you just don't care about your product very much, because animation is very much a trial and error process. It's inevitable that you're going to make mistakes, that you could improve upon what you do. And I think that also coincides with the mindset of good artwork. Like when people see a polished Disney movie or a Pixar film, they are seeing, the labor, obviously, of years and years of work. But what they may not understand is that those years and years of work, there's a lot of mistakes that happen. There's a lot of things that were redone that were not acceptable to them, and they're striving for perfection. And you can't strive for perfection if you just accept the first result every single time. Alright, so there's my first render. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Open up the window and see what this looks like. Okay, so there's my smooth, slow-moving behemoth spaceship from a distance, and my little spaceship zipping around it. It looks pretty good even without the motion blur, but motion blur would really accent the streaks of that darting spaceship going up and around the big one, and it would look a lot better. And if you really want to, you can loop your playback if you're just studying something and you really want to look at it again and again, especially with shorter shots like this one. It may help to loop it to sort of, I like to sit back and watch it several times to look at the flaws, look for the mistakes. What could be better about this shot? Could I change the position of the lighting? Would it look better if it was lit from the side as opposed to the back as it is now? Does the little spaceship take full advantage of the frame, or could the composition be improved? So these are some of the things I might look and analyze this shot for. But this tutorial was meant to be a starting point and to get you familiar with some of the keyframe features in Lightwave that are important. So I hope it's done that, and we'll end it there and see you on the next round.